The Sterling Matchworks had already claimed 3 lives before the city condemned it. But Anika Washington, a single mother working double shifts to keep her son fed, was about to inherit its most lethal secret, a sulfur vault holding not just poison, but a fortune that could rewrite her future or bury her beside the others. If you're ready for a story about legacy, sacrifice, and the hidden price of wealth, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's step back into the shadows of Sterling. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, a day already gray with the threat of rain and the exhaust fumes that perpetually clung to the windows of her fourth-floor walk-up. It was an anomaly in the usual stack of final notices and brightly colored junk mail promising debt relief that was anything but. The envelope was heavy, made of a creamy, fibrous paper that felt ancient and important, a relic from a time when correspondence carried weight. The return address was a law firm she had never heard of, a prestigious name with an address downtown where the building scraped the clouds and the air smelled of clean money and ambition, a world away from her own. Anika held it under the flickering fluorescent light of her kitchenette, her fingers, calloused from scrubbing floors and stocking shelves, tracing the embossed seal. Her son, 7-year-old Leo, was asleep in the next room, his small breaths a steady, reassuring rhythm in the quiet apartment. For a moment, she allowed herself a flicker of fantasy, a long-lost relative, a forgotten insurance policy, a clerical error in her favor. But reality, a constant and unforgiving companion, quickly extinguished the thought. Good news did not come in envelopes like this. Good news did not come at all. She slid it open with a butter knife, her heart a tight drum against her ribs. The language inside was dense, a thicket of legal terminology that snagged her tired mind. She had to read it 3 times before the words untangled themselves and settled into a coherent, unbelievable statement. She, Anika Marie Washington, was the sole living heir to the estate of Silas Sterling, her great-great-grandfather. The estate consisted of a single asset, the property and grounds of the Sterling Matchworks, located at the industrial edge of the city. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She sank onto a wobbly kitchen chair, the letter trembling in her hand. Sterling Matchworks. The name was a ghost from her grandmother's stories, a whispered footnote in their family history. It was a place of myth and misfortune, a skeletal ruin that locals used to scare their children. A place, her grandmother had said with a shudder, built on sorrow and smoke. The letter went on, its tone clinically detached from the absurdity of the situation. It detailed the property's status, condemned by the city decades ago, a designated brownfield site, a toxic liability. And then came the final crushing blow. The property carried an outstanding tax lien of $78,000, a sum so astronomical it might as well have been $1 billion. Failure to settle the debt within 90 days would result in the city seizing the property. The lawyer and Mr. Alistair Finch invited her to schedule an appointment to discuss the transfer of title and associated obligations. Obligations. That was the word that echoed in the silent apartment. This wasn't a gift. It was a curse. A $78,000 anchor tied to a sinking ship, and they were handing her the chain. She laughed, a short, bitter sound that was half a sob. They might as well have sent her a bill for the air she breathed. She thought of Leo, of the worn-out soles on his sneakers, of the way he never asked for anything because he knew she couldn't afford it. She thought of her 2 jobs, the pre-dawn custodial shift at a downtown office building and the evening shift stocking shelves at a sterile, soulless supermarket. She was a ghost in both places, invisible, wiping away the smudges of other people's lives, organizing the abundance they took for granted. Her life was a meticulous, exhausting balancing act, a constant triage of bills and needs, and there was never, ever anything left over. This inheritance was not a lifeline. It was a joke, a cruel cosmic punchline delivered a century too late. She wanted to rip the letter to shreds, to burn it and pretend it never existed. But she couldn't, because beneath the crushing weight of the debt, a tiny, persistent question began to form. Why? Why, after all this time, was this ruin being passed down to her? Her great-great-grandfather, Silas Sterling, was a phantom. The family spoke of him in hushed, contradictory tones. A brilliant industrialist, a cruel taskmaster, a man who had built an empire from nothing and then vanished from the family records, his name synonymous with a vague, unspoken shame. What had he left behind in that husk of a factory? What secrets were buried under a century of rust and rubble? The rain began to fall, tapping a somber rhythm against the glass. Anika stared out at the city lights, blurred and distant. The letter lay on the table, a pale rectangle in the dim light. It was a burden, a problem she didn't have the time or the money to solve. But it was also a thread, a connection to a past she had never known, a story that was, for better or worse, hers. She knew she couldn't pay the taxes. She knew she couldn't afford the lawyer. But she also knew she couldn't just let it go. She had to see it. She had to stand on the ground her ancestor had owned, to breathe the air of the place that had defined and then destroyed him. She had to understand the legacy that had just been dropped, like a stone, into the shallow waters of her life. The drive to the industrial periphery took her through layers of the city's history, from the gentrified brick warehouses, now housing art galleries and coffee shops, to the crumbling residential blocks that time had forgotten. The sky was a sheet of dull pewter, and a persistent drizzle slicked the roads, making the world outside her rattling sedan seem gray and indistinct. As she drew closer, the buildings grew squat and utilitarian, their windows dark and vacant. The air itself seemed to change, growing heavier, tasting of damp earth and old metal. And then she saw it. The Sterling Matchworks did not rise so much as it sagged, a colossal skeleton slumping against the horizon. It was a fortress of faded red brick, its walls streaked with black grime, its roof a jagged line of collapsed timbers and gaping holes. A massive smokestack, a silent, soot-stained finger, pointed accusingly at the sky. The property was encircled by a formidable chain-link fence topped with coils of rusted barbed wire. Signs, faded to near illegibility by sun and rain, warned of danger, of toxic materials, of unstable structures. Trespassers will be prosecuted. The words were a dare. Anika pulled her car onto the muddy shoulder of the road, the engine ticking as it cooled. She got out, the damp chill seeping into her thin jacket. The silence was profound, broken only by the drip of water from skeletal trees and the distant hum of the highway. The sheer scale of the place was overwhelming. It wasn't just a building, it was a compound, a small, self-contained world of decay. She could see the outlines of smaller auxiliary buildings, their roofs caved in, their walls surrendering to thick carpets of ivy. This was not just abandoned, it was dead, a monument to failure. She walked the perimeter, her boots sinking into the soft, damp ground. The fence was a formidable barrier, but near the back of the property, where the woods pressed in close, a section had been pulled down, bent and twisted, a clear invitation for the curious or the desperate. She hesitated for only a moment, the warnings on the signs echoing in her mind. But the pull of the place, the need to understand the weight that had been settled upon her shoulders, was stronger than her fear. She slipped through the gap, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm. The air inside the fence was different, stiller, thick with the smell of wet rot and something else, something acrid and chemical that caught in the back of her throat. It was the ghost of sulfur, the faint, lingering breath of the factory's purpose. She moved slowly, cautiously, through the tall, wet weeds, her eyes scanning the debris that littered the ground. Shards of glass, rusted machine parts, the pale, ghostly fragments of old work gloves. It felt like walking through a battlefield long after the war had ended. The main building loomed before her, a cathedral of industry now consecrated to ruin. Most of the windows were shattered, dark, vacant eyes staring out at nothing. But the main entrance, a massive arched doorway, was sealed with a sheet of corrugated steel, bolted and padlocked. There was no way in. She circled the building, her hand trailing along the cold, rough brick. The walls were a canvas of graffiti, layers of names and symbols painted over one another, a testament to decades of illicit visitors. She felt a profound sense of loneliness, of being an intruder in a place that held her own history. Near what she guessed was a rear loading dock, half submerged in a pool of stagnant, iridescent water, she saw it. Tucked into a recess in the brickwork, Almost perfectly concealed by a thick growth of ivy was a small iron box set into the wall. It was a lockbox, ancient and rusted, the kind she had only seen in old movies. It didn't have a modern lock but a keyhole, ornate and complex. It seemed impossible that it could have remained undiscovered for so long. Her breath caught. Driven by an instinct she didn't understand, she began to pull at the ivy, the rough leaves scratching her hands. The box was firmly embedded. She looked around, her eyes landing on a length of rusted rebar lying in the weeds. Using it as a lever, she wedged it into the seam between the box and the brick and pulled. The mortar was old and brittle. With a groan of protest and a shower of red dust, the box broke free. It was heavy, far heavier than it looked. She carried it back toward the fence, her mind racing. What could be inside? Deeds? Papers? Nothing? Back in the relative safety of her car, she placed the box on the passenger seat. It was sealed tight with rust. She used the tire iron from her trunk, jamming it into the lid and prying with all her strength. The metal shrieked, then gave way with a sudden, loud crack. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded, velvet-like material that had mostly disintegrated into dust, were two items. The first was a key. It was large and heavy, made of blackened brass, its head shaped into an intricate, stylized letter S. It was a key meant for a lock of great importance. The second item was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover warped and stained by moisture. She picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly. The leather was cold and stiff. She opened it carefully, the spine cracking in protest. The first page was a wall of dense, elegant cursive, faded but still legible. The ink was a deep sepia. It was not a date or a greeting, but a statement, a declaration. They see only the fire, it began. They speak of the light it casts, the warmth it gives, but they do not understand the nature of the thing itself. Phosphorus, the light bearer, a name for a fallen angel. It promises brilliance but demands a sacrifice. I have built this house on its promise, a lighthouse in the dark. But I fear the light is a lie, and the only thing it illuminates is the wreckage it creates. The burden of light is heavier than any darkness. Anika read the words again and then a third time. The language was strange, poetic, and filled with a deep, aching melancholy. A lighthouse in the dark, the burden of light. It wasn't the writing of a proud industrialist. It was the writing of a haunted man. A cold dread, mingled with an intense, burning curiosity, settled deep within her. This journal was not just a record, it was a confession. And the key was a promise. A promise that somewhere inside that dying giant of a building, a lock was waiting. The $78,000 debt suddenly felt secondary, a mundane problem in the face of a much deeper, more profound mystery. The factory was not just a toxic asset, it was a tomb, a story, a puzzle. And she, Anika Washington, was the only one left to solve it. The city felt different on the drive home. The familiar landscape of concrete and steel seemed charged with a new significance, every shadow holding a potential secret, every crumbling facade a story of its own. Anika clutched the steering wheel, the old journal and the heavy brass key resting on the seat beside her, a tangible link to a past that was rapidly becoming her present. The weight of them was both a comfort and a threat. Back in her apartment, the air was warm and smelled of the faint, sweet scent of her sleeping son. She stood over his bed for a long time, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest. His face, so peaceful in sleep, was a stark contrast to the turmoil in her own mind. This was why she fought so hard. This small, perfect life. This was what was at stake. But what did this inheritance mean for him? Was it a danger she was foolishly inviting into their lives? Or could it somehow be a path to a future she had never dared to imagine? She made a cup of tea, her hands still not quite steady, and sat at her small kitchen table under the buzzing fluorescent light. The journal lay open before her. The ink on the first page seemed to shimmer, the words of Silas Sterling reaching across a century to speak directly to her. Phosphorus, the light bearer. She typed the word into her phone's search engine. The results were stark. White phosphorus, the key ingredient in the strike anywhere matches that had made Silas's fortune. A substance known for its incandescence, for its ability to create light, and for its toxicity. She read about the horrific industrial disease that had plagued matchstick workers, particularly young women. Phosphorus necrosis of the jaw, commonly known as phossy jaw. It was a gruesome, painful condition where the phosphorus vapors would attack the jawbone, causing it to decay, to glow with a ghastly greenish-white light in the dark, and to eventually rot away entirely. The screen of her phone glowed with macabre, 19th century medical drawings of afflicted workers, their faces disfigured, their expressions a mask of perpetual agony. The burden of light. The phrase from the journal slammed into her with new sickening force. Silas hadn't been speaking metaphorically. He had been speaking of a literal, horrifying reality. He knew. He knew the light his factory produced was poisoning his workers. She turned the page in the journal, her fingers feeling clumsy and thick. The next entry was dated 1888. The handwriting was tighter, more controlled. The union men came today, Silas wrote. They spoke of ventilation, of safety, of alternate compounds. They are fools. They do not understand the market. Our brilliance is our edge. The Swedish red phosphorus is safe, they say, but it is dull. It requires a special surface. It is a captured flame. The world does not want a captured flame. It wants fire in its pocket. It wants to strike a light against any surface, to command the flame at will. This is what we sell. Not a match, but power. A small, fleeting omnipotence. For that, there is a kund. The cost is not mine to bear. The coldness of the words chilled her to the bone. The cost is not mine to bear. It was the casual cruelty of a man completely detached from the human consequences of his ambition. He saw his workers not as people, but as components in his machine, as fuel for his fire. Anika felt a wave of shame, a deep ancestral revulsion. This was her blood. This cold, calculating man was a part of her story. She kept reading, flipping through pages that detailed production quotas, chemical supply routes and profit margins, all interspersed with those strange philosophical musings. Then she came to an entry that was different. The handwriting was shaky, the ink splattered in places, as if the pen had been trembling in his hand. Her name was Alara, it began. She was young, 17. They said she was the fastest worker on the line, her fingers a blur as she dipped the splints. I saw her last week. Her face was swollen. She tried to hide it with a scarf, but I saw the glow. At night in the dark dormitory, they said her jaw would emit a faint, ghostly light, the light we sell, the light she packed into boxes 1,000 times a day. Today, she is gone. The foreman reported it as an infection, a toothache that went bad. He gave her family a severance of $5. $5 for a life consumed by my light. I saw her file. She had a sister who depended on her. Now they are both adrift. I am building an empire, but its foundations are laid with the bones of children like Alara. What kind of man builds a house on such ground? The entry ended there, a stark admission of guilt. He wasn't just a monster, he was a man who knew he was a monster. The knowledge did not absolve him, but it complicated him. It made the story heavier, more tragic. Anika closed the journal, the image of Alara, her jaw glowing with a deathly light, burned into her mind. The factory was not just a ruin of brick and steel. It was a graveyard. The first of the 3 workers the local legends whispered about. It wasn't a ghost story, it was history. A history of exploitation, of pain, of a fortune built on the suffering of the powerless. She thought of her own life, of the quiet indignities she endured every day. The condescending supervisors, the aching muscles, the constant gnawing anxiety of not having enough. Her struggles were real, but they were nothing compared to the slow, agonizing death Alara had faced. The $78,000 tax bill, the imposing factory, the mysterious key, it all felt different now. This was no longer just about a strange inheritance. It was about justice. It was about bearing witness to a forgotten crime. Anika felt a shift inside her, a hardening of resolve. She was no longer just a struggling, single mother. She was the inheritor of a dark legacy, and with it, a profound responsibility. She didn't know what she was looking for or what she could possibly do, but she knew she had to go back. She had to find the lock that matched Silas Sterling's key. She had to uncover the rest of the story, not for the sake of a potential fortune, but for the sake of Alara, the girl whose life had been extinguished by the light bearer. The rain had stopped, and the first hints of dawn were beginning to soften the edges of the night sky. Annika hadn't slept. She felt a strange, weary clarity. The path forward was dark and uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of purpose that transcended the daily struggle for survival. She was no longer just running from the past. She was running toward it. The following days were a tightrope walk between her demanding present and the consuming past. By day, she was the invisible worker, her mind 1,000 miles away as she mopped floors and stocked shelves, the words from Silas's journal echoing in her head. By night, she was a historian, a detective poring over the brittle pages, cross-referencing names and dates with whatever scraps of information she could find online about the Sterling Matchworks. The factory became an obsession, a dark star pulling her into its orbit. The pressure of her ordinary life did not relent. A notice from Leo's school informed her of a mandatory fee for an upcoming field trip, a small amount that felt like a mountain. Her car began making a new alarming noise, a rhythmic clanking that spelled an expensive repair she couldn't afford. These were the 1,000 tiny cuts of poverty, a constant reminder of the precariousness of her world. And then, a new pressure emerged, this one far more sinister. A phone call came during her short break at the supermarket, the caller ID an unfamiliar number with a downtown exchange. She answered, expecting a telemarketer. The voice on the other end was smooth, polished, and radiated an unnerving confidence. "Ms. Annika Washington?" he asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. "My name is Julian Thorne. I represent a consortium of historical preservation and urban development investors. I believe we have a matter of mutual interest to discuss." Anika's blood ran cold. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Of course you do, Ms. Washington," Thorne said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I'm referring to the Sterling Matchworks, a fascinating piece of industrial history, and I understand your new inheritance." How could he know? The thought screamed through her mind. The letter from the lawyer had been delivered less than a week ago. She hadn't told a soul. "It's a complicated property," Thorne continued, his voice a low, persuasive purr. "A significant environmental liability. The cleanup costs alone would be astronomical. Not to mention the back taxes. The city is not known for its patience in these matters." "What do you want?" Anika asked, her voice tight. "My associates and I have a vested interest in the history of that particular industrial sector. We see potential in the land once it's been properly remediated. We are prepared to make you a generous offer, Ms. Washington. We will assume the full tax liability and provide you with a cash settlement of $25,000. A clean break. You walk away, free and clear of the entire affair." $25,000. The number hung in the air, shimmering like a mirage. It was a life-changing amount of money. It would fix her car. It would pay her rent for 2 years. It would give her and Leo a cushion, a chance to breathe. It was a lifeline thrown from a sleek, invisible yacht. But her instincts screamed that it was a trap. Why would a powerful developer be so interested in a condemned, toxic ruin? Why offer her anything at all when they could just wait for the city to seize it and buy it at auction for a fraction of the price? "Why are you offering me this?" she asked, trying to keep the suspicion out of her voice. "Let's just say we value discretion and a speedy resolution," Thorne replied smoothly. "Going through the city is a bureaucratic nightmare. Dealing with you directly is simply more efficient. We see this as helping you out of a difficult situation." He didn't know about the journal. He didn't know about the key. He saw her as she appeared on paper, a desperate single mother who would surely leap at the first offer of cash. He saw her as a problem that could be easily solved with money. The memory of Alara, the girl with the glowing palm, flashed in her mind. The cost is not mine to bear. Silas's cold words echoed Thorne's casual, predatory charm. They were cut from the same cloth. Men who saw the world as a collection of assets and liabilities, people included. "I need to think about it," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Of course," Thorne said, his tone unwavering. "But don't think for too long. The city's clock is ticking, And our offer is contingent on a swift, private transaction. I'll be in touch." He hung up, leaving Annika in a state of vibrating tension. The offer was a temptation, a devil's bargain. It was the easy way out. But she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that the Sterling Matchworks was worth far more than the $25,000 to Julian Thorne. And the reason was hidden somewhere within its decaying walls. That evening, the city sent its own message. A second letter, this one on stark, intimidating letterhead from the Department of Taxation and Finance. The language was sharper, less formal. It was a final demand notice. Payment of the $78,000 lien was due in 60 days. Legal proceedings would commence immediately thereafter. The walls were closing in. On one side was the city, an impersonal, bureaucratic machine ready to crush her. On the other was Thorne, a smiling predator, offering a poisoned escape. They were both vultures, circling what they believed to be a carcass. They didn't know that the carcass still had a secret. Annika looked from the threatening letter to the journal lying on her table. She was trapped, caught between two powerful forces, each with its own agenda. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. But beneath the fear, a different feeling was taking root. A stubborn, defiant anger. This was her legacy, her history, her mystery to solve. It did not belong to the city, and it did not belong to Julian Thorne. She would not be scared away. She would not be bought. She had to get back inside that factory. She had to find what Thorne was so desperate to acquire. The pressure was no longer just a weight, it was a crucible, and it was forging her fear into a weapon. She would find the lock. She would learn the truth. And she would not let them win. The journal became her guide, her Rosetta Stone for deciphering the factory's secrets. She read it not just for its confessions, but for its operational details, hoping for a clue, a map, a hint of where Silas might have hidden his most important secrets. Amidst the cold ledgers and paranoid ramblings, she found what she was looking for, a section detailing a catastrophic accident, a second death that had clearly shaken Silas to his core. "The sulfur ignited," he wrote, the script more frantic than in his entry about Alara. "A spark from a dropped tool," the foreman said. The air itself became fire, a blue spectral flame that consumed everything. "We found what was left of Marcus in the West Wing, by the grinding mills. He was a good man, a stern man, but fair. He had a wife, 2 sons. He had warned me about the dust. He had told me we needed better ventilation, better protocols for handling the raw sulfur. I told him we couldn't afford the downtime. A lie. I simply did not want to spend the money. Now Marcus is dead, and his death has cost me more than any ventilation system. The other men look at me differently. They see me not as a captain of industry, but as a purveyor of death. They are right. The fire that took Marcus was my fire. I lit the match." This entry was different from the one about Alara. Her death had been a slow, insidious poisoning, a tragedy Silas could observe from a clinical distance. This one was sudden, violent, and undeniably his fault. It was a failure of leadership, a direct consequence of his greed. The guilt was more acute, more personal. Annika felt a grim sense of validation. The factory wasn't just haunted by whispered legends. It was saturated with real documented tragedy. 2 deaths, both preventable, both the result of a relentless pursuit of profit. The mention of the West Wing and the grinding mills gave her a specific location to focus on. But it was the next part of the entry that made her lean in, her breath held tight. Following the description of the fire, Silas's tone shifted from guilt to a cold, calculating paranoia. "The vultures are circling," he wrote. "The whispers in the city have begun. They speak of shutting me down. My partners, my investors, they see my grief not as a tragedy, but as a weakness, an opening. They think the fire has exposed me. They are wrong. It has taught me. It has taught me that what is valuable must be protected not just by walls of brick, but by fire and fear. I cannot trust the banks. I cannot trust my own partners. My true legacy, the source of this enterprise, must be buried where no one will ever think to look. It must be hidden in the belly of the beast, guarded by the very poison that gives us our power. A foundation of stone, a heart of sulfur. A foundation of stone, a heart of sulfur." The words were cryptic, but the intent was clear. He had hidden something, something of immense value, something that his own business partners wanted. Anika's mind immediately went to Julian Thorne. My associates and I have a vested interest in the history of that particular industrial sector. It hadn't been a lie. Thorne's consortium wasn't just some random developer. They were the descendants, professionally or corporately, of Silas's original partners. They were still looking for his true legacy. This wasn't just about land. It was a treasure hunt that had been going on for a century. She turned the page and her heart stopped. Tucked into a slit in the thick leather backing of the journal was a folded piece of paper. It was incredibly thin, almost translucent, and crackled as she carefully unfolded it. It was a blueprint, or rather a partial blueprint, drawn by hand in the same sepia ink as the journal entries. It showed a detailed schematic of the factory's lower level, focusing on the boiler room in the west wing, where the fire had occurred. The layout was complex, a maze of pipes, furnaces, and machinery. But in the center of the drawing, connected to the main boiler room by a passage that was not labeled, was a room that she knew instinctively was not on any official city plan. It was a perfect circle, thick-walled, with a single heavy-looking door. And inside the circle, Silas had written 2 words, Ignis et Clavis, fire and key. Below the drawing was another short, chilling note. Let them look, let them dig. They will find only ash and bones. They seek a fortune in paper, in gold, in ledgers. They do not understand. The real wealth is not what can be counted, but what can be transformed. Fire purifies, fire protects. The way is through the dragon's throat. The dragon's throat, the main furnace of the boiler room. Anika stared at the drawing, a map to the heart of the mystery. This was it, the place where the key would work, the place Thorne was looking for. She knew without a doubt that this secret room was the sulfur vault. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a potent mix of terror and exhilaration. She was no longer just piecing together the past. She was holding the key to it, literally and figuratively. The moral weight of her quest intensified. This wasn't just about uncovering a historical injustice anymore. It was about a hidden fortune, a fortune that was clearly tied to the factory's dark history. What was this true legacy that Silas had hidden, and what would it mean for her, for Leo, if she found it? The blueprint felt heavy in her hand, a dangerous piece of knowledge. It made her a target. Thorne's polite, veiled threats now seemed much more real. He wasn't just trying to swindle her out of a piece of land. He was trying to get his hands on this map. She had to move quickly. She had to get into that vault before Thorne escalated his efforts, before he found another way to get to it. The next night, under the cover of darkness, she would return to the Sterling Matchworks. She would follow the map. She would go through the dragon's throat, and she would find out what was so valuable it had to be guarded by fire and poison for 100 years. The night was moonless, a thick blanket of clouds smothering the city lights and casting the industrial district into an even deeper gloom. Anika parked her car several blocks away from the factory, her heart a frantic, hammering drum against her ribs. In her backpack, she carried a powerful flashlight, a crowbar, the journal, the blueprint, and the heavy brass key. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. She was no longer just a trespasser. She was an infiltrator on a mission, and the sense of danger was palpable. She slipped through the same gap in the fence, the familiar scent of damp decay and sulfur welcoming her like a morbid embrace. The factory was a different beast at night, a hulking black silhouette that seemed to breathe in the darkness. Its broken windows were empty sockets in a colossal skull. Using the blueprint as her guide, she navigated around the main building to the west wing, the site of the fatal fire. The wall here was different, a patchwork of newer and older brick, evidence of the repairs made after the explosion. A section of the wall had crumbled away, leaving a dark, jagged opening just large enough to squeeze through. This was her way in. She took a deep breath, fighting down a wave of claustrophobia, and wriggled through the gap, the rough brick scraping her back. She was inside. The air was thick and cold, heavy with the dust of a century. Her flashlight beam cut a sharp, lonely cone through the absolute blackness, revealing a vast, cavernous space. The ghosts of massive machines, the grinding mills Silas had written about, stood silent and shrouded in cobwebs, their iron bodies thick with rust. The floor was a treacherous landscape of rubble and debris. The silence was absolute, a heavy pressing weight that made the sound of her own breathing seem deafeningly loud. She moved cautiously, her light dancing across the cavernous space, following the path laid out on the hand-drawn map. The blueprint led her out of the grinding room and into a long, dark corridor. Water dripped from the ceiling, each drop echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. She felt a profound sense of trespassing, of walking through a place that had sealed its secrets away long ago. Finally, the corridor opened into the boiler room. It was the belly of the beast, just as Silas had described. A monstrous furnace, the dragon's throat, dominated the center of the room. Its iron door rusted shut, its belly cold for the first time in decades. Pipes as thick as tree trunks snaked across the walls and ceiling, disappearing into the darkness. According to the blueprint, the entrance to the vault was not in the furnace itself, but hidden behind it. Annika squeezed past the cold iron behemoth, her flashlight beam searching the brick wall behind it. It looked solid, a seamless wall of grime-covered brick, but the map was insistent. She ran her hands over the cold, rough surface, feeling for any irregularity, any seam or crack. Nothing. Despair began to prick at her. Had she come all this way for nothing? Had the passage collapsed? Then her fingers brushed against something. A single brick near the floor that felt slightly loose. Her heart leaped. Using the tip of the crowbar, she worked it into the mortar surrounding the brick. The old material crumbled easily. She pried the brick out, then another and another. Behind them was not more brick, but a hollow darkness. She had found it. After clearing a hole large enough to crawl through, she shone her light inside. It was a narrow, low-ceilinged tunnel, just as the blueprint had shown. The air that flowed out was stale and carried a much stronger, sharper smell of sulfur. It was suffocating, the smell of hell itself. Hesitantly, she crawled into the tunnel, pulling her backpack in after her. It was a tight, terrifying squeeze. The darkness was absolute, and the silence was so complete she could hear the blood pounding in her ears. The tunnel was short, no more than 20 feet long. It ended at a wall of solid iron, and set into the center of that wall was a door, a round, heavy door like that of a bank vault. In its center was a single ornate keyhole, the lock the key was made for. Her hand trembled as she pulled the brass key from her pack. It felt warm, alive in her palm. She inserted it into the lock. It slid in perfectly, a perfect fit after 100 years of waiting. She turned it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, groaning shudder that seemed to run through the very foundations of the factory, ancient tumblers shifted. A loud, definitive clunk echoed in the small space. She pulled on the heavy iron handle. The door was immensely heavy, but it moved, swinging inward on silent, well-oiled hinges. Annika shone her light into the darkness beyond. It was a circular room, just as the blueprint depicted. But it was not empty. The chamber was lined with shelves, and on those shelves were not barrels of sulfur, but dozens of heavy lead-lined boxes, each stenciled with the same stylized S as the key. A heart of sulfur. Silas had not been literal. The room was not filled with sulfur. It was protected by it, the scent a potent deterrent to the curious. But what was in the boxes? With her heart pounding, she stepped into the vault. She approached one of the boxes and wiped away a thick layer of dust from its lid. It was sealed with a simple latch. She lifted it. The lead lid was heavy. She raised it and pointed her flashlight inside. The light struck something and was instantly shattered, exploding into 1,000 brilliant, prismatic shards of color that danced across the dark walls of the vault. Annika gasped, stumbling back. She had expected gold, or cash, or bonds. She had not expected this. The box was filled to the brim with uncut gemstones. Diamonds mostly, but also rubies and sapphires. A king's ransom of raw, magnificent jewels, glowing with a cold, inner fire under the beam of her light. She reached in, her fingers brushing against the cool, hard facets of the stones. They felt like fragments of a fallen star. She scooped up a handful. They were heavy, real, and utterly, terrifyingly valuable. This was the true legacy. This was the source of the sterling fortune. It wasn't just from matches. This was a treasure of unimaginable worth, hundreds of millions of dollars. Enough to solve every problem she had ever had, 1,000 times over. But as the initial shock subsided, a cold, sickening realization began to dawn. This kind of wealth, in the hands of a 19th century industrialist like Silas Sterling, did not come from legitimate sources. This was blood money. The factory, the exploited workers, the Fosse jaw, the sulfur fire, it was all a front, a way to launder and conceal a fortune built on something far darker. The journal entry from the day of the fire came back to her. My partners, they think the fire has exposed me. He wasn't worried about factory safety regulations. He was worried about his criminal conspiracy being discovered. Anika let the diamonds trickle through her fingers back into the box. They were beautiful, mesmerizing, but they felt tainted, poisonous. This was the burden of light he had written about on the first page. It was never about the phosphorus. It was about this vault of stolen, glittering light. And now the burden was hers. The weight of the discovery was crushing. Anika sat on the cold floor of the vault, the beam of her flashlight fixed on the open box of diamonds, her mind struggling to process the enormity of what she had found. This was not a solution. It was a crisis of a magnitude she had never imagined. The gems were a path to freedom, a one-way ticket out of the relentless grind of her life. She could take them, disappear, and give Leo a life of security and opportunity she had only ever dreamed of. No more double shifts, no more choosing between bills and groceries, no more fear. The temptation was a physical thing, a siren song that promised to drown out all her anxieties. But the faces of the dead rose up in her mind. Ilara, with her glowing, decaying jaw. Marcus, the foreman consumed by a sulfur fire. Their lives had been sacrificed, directly or indirectly, for the wealth that now lay at her feet. To take it for herself would be to endorse Silas's cold calculus, to agree that his fortune was worth more than their lives. It would make her a participant in his crimes a century removed. The thought was sickening. She felt as though she were standing on a precipice, with two futures branching out before her. One was easy, comfortable, and morally bankrupt. The other was, what? She didn't know, but she knew it had to be different. She had to find the rest of the story. She turned her attention back to the journal, her hands shaking as she searched for an entry that could explain the origin of the gems. She found it deep in the latter half of the book, in a section where the handwriting had become almost unhinged, a desperate scrawl that barely stayed on the lines. He knew, the entry began, without preamble. My own brother, Daniel. He was supposed to be the good one, the scholar. He never approved of my methods, but he took the money I sent him for his books in his quiet life. Then he grew a conscience. Or perhaps it was greed. He came to the factory unannounced. He saw the ledgers I kept hidden, the ones that detailed the shipments from the diamond fields, the bribes to the port officials, the names of my silent, vicious partners. He called it a river of blood flowing from a distant continent into my coffers. He threatened to expose me, to the authorities, to the press, to ruin everything. Anika's breath caught in her throat. Silas had a brother. This was a part of the family history that had been completely erased. The entry continued, each word a drop of poison. I tried to reason with him. I offered him a share, more than he could ever spend. He refused. He spoke of morality, of the exploited miners, of the blood on my hands. He saw only the sin, not the glorious, shining result. He left me no choice. An empire cannot be built by saints, and it cannot be dismantled by them either. I told him to meet me in the East Wing, by the vat of potash. We would talk, I said, settle things. He was my brother. He trusted me. The next few lines were heavily blotted, the ink smeared as if by tears or a trembling hand. There was a slip, a terrible accident. That is what the report says. He fell. No one saw, no one heard. It was quick. I tell myself it was quick. I am a builder. I am a creator of light. But I am also Cain. I have slain my own brother for the sake of these shining stones. And the guilt is a fire that the potash could not extinguish. It burns in my gut. It turns my food to ash. It hollows me out from the inside. Anika felt a wave of nausea. The third death. The local legends had been right. 3 lives claimed by the Sterling Matchworks, a young female worker, a foreman, and the founder's own brother. It was a litany of horror, a foundation of sin upon which an empire was built. This vault was not a treasure chest. It was a tomb, a monument to Silas's ultimate crime, the one that had clearly broken him and sent him into the paranoid spiral that led him to seal it all away. The final entry in the journal was short, written in a hand so shaky it was almost illegible. The light is a lie. I see Daniel's face in the flame of every match. I see Alara's glow in the darkness behind my eyes. I hear Marcus's scream in the silence of my office. This fortune is a curse. It is a poisoned light. It can purchase anything but peace. I seal it away, not to protect it, but to contain it, like a plague. Perhaps one day a descendant with a stronger soul than mine will find it. They will face the same choice I did, wealth or righteousness. This treasure can only be redeemed by an act of immense sacrifice. It must be used not to build an empire, but to heal the wounds my empire created. Otherwise, let it rot in the darkness forever. Let it be my hell. Anika closed the journal, the final words echoing in the silent, suffocating vault. An act of immense sacrifice. To heal the wounds. Silas, in his final moments of clarity, had laid out the terms of her inheritance. He wasn't passing on wealth. He was passing on a test. A moral crucible. The weight on her shoulders was no longer just the secret of the fortune, but the explicit instructions for its use. She couldn't take it for herself. It was never meant for her. It was meant as an atonement. As she sat there in the darkness, surrounded by a fortune that could change her life, but would destroy her soul, she finally understood. The inheritance wasn't the diamonds, it was the choice. The factory wasn't a liability. It was a stage set for a final century-old drama. And she was its lead actor. The lure of the money was still there, a persistent, seductive whisper, but it was weaker now, drowned out by the screams of the past. Her own struggles, which had once seemed so overwhelming, now felt small in comparison to the scale of this tragedy. She was a part of this story now, inextricably linked to Alara, Marcus, and Daniel. Her legacy would not be one of wealth, it would be one of justice. The path forward was terrifyingly unclear, but the moral direction was, for the first time, crystal clear. She had to honor the dead. She had to heal the wounds. She had to find a way to use this poison light to create something good. Leaving the vault felt like surfacing from a deep, dark ocean. Anika sealed the heavy iron door, the sound of the tumblers locking into place, echoing with a grim finality. She crawled back through the narrow tunnel and painstakingly replaced the bricks, concealing the entrance once more. As she emerged from the factory into the pre-dawn gray, the city air, usually so choked with fumes, felt clean and fresh. The world seemed different, sharper, as if a veil had been lifted. The knowledge she carried was a heavy burden, but it was also a source of strange, terrifying power. She now understood the stakes completely. Julian Thorne and his consortium weren't just looking for a lost treasure. They were the descendants of Silas's partners in crime, trying to reclaim their share of a blood-soaked fortune. Their vested interest in the history was an attempt to complete a century-old theft. Thorne's polite phone call now seemed like the gentle circling of a shark. He had underestimated her, seen her as a pawn to be easily removed from the board. He had no idea she had found the prize. But he would not give up. She knew his next move would get more aggressive. The thought sent a chill of fear down her spine. A fear that was no longer abstract but sharp and specific. This had moved beyond a moral dilemma and into the realm of real physical danger. The fear was not just for herself, but for Leo. The image of his sleeping face, so innocent and vulnerable, solidified her resolve. She could not expose him to this. She could not let the violence of Silas's world touch his. When she got home, the sun was just rising. Leo was still asleep. She watched him for a long time, the fierce, primal instinct of a mother rising up in her. She had to protect him, not just from poverty, but from the corrosive influence of this tainted wealth and the dangerous men who pursued it. Later that morning, the phone rang. It was Thorne. His voice had lost its smooth, patient veneer. It was now clipped, edged with impatience. Ms. Washington, he said, dispensing with pleasantries, I trust you have had time to consider my generous offer. It wasn't generous, Anika said, her own voice surprising her with its steadiness. And I'm not interested. There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line. She could almost feel his surprise, his calculation. I think you're making a mistake, he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. You're a single mother, Ms. Washington. A boy, isn't it? Leo, it would be a shame if your stubbornness were to create an unstable environment for him. The city can be a dangerous place for a child without resources. The threat was unmistakable, a cold blade pressed against the most vulnerable part of her life. Rage, pure and hot, surged through her, burning away the last vestiges of her fear. He had crossed a line. He had brought her son into it. Are you threatening me? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. I'm advising you, Thorne countered smoothly. I'm advising you to take the money and walk away from something you don't understand. My associates have a legitimate historical claim to certain assets that may be located on that property. We are prepared to enforce that claim. Do not stand in our way. He hung up. Anika stood trembling, not with fear, but with fury. The choice was no longer just a moral one. It was a fight for her son's safety, for her own integrity, and for the memory of the dead. Thorne thought he could intimidate her, that her poverty was a weakness he could exploit. He was wrong. Her poverty, her struggle, had forged a resilience in her that he could not possibly comprehend. She had been fighting her entire life. This was just a new opponent. She looked at the journal, at the blueprint, at the heavy brass keys sitting on her table. These were not just historical artifacts anymore. They were evidence, they were weapons. Silas's final entry echoed in her mind. Heal the wounds my empire created. Anika now knew what she had to do. She could not simply hand the diamonds over to the authorities. The story was too complex, the legal ownership too murky. Thorne's consortium, with its powerful lawyers, could easily tie it up in court for years, claiming it as a corporate asset and bearing the history of where it came from. The story itself was the key. The truth was the only thing that could disinfect this poisoned fortune. She had to bring it all into the light. Silas's crimes, his brother's murder, the exploitation of his workers, and the modern-day conspiracy by Thorne's company to reclaim the illicit profits. The diamonds were not the prize. They were the proof. They were the leverage she needed to ensure the truth was heard. Her plan began to form, a risky and audacious strategy. She couldn't fight Thorne's power with power, or his money with money. She had to fight him with the one thing he didn't have, a just cause. She would not be a victim. She would not be a pawn. She would become the instrument of Silas's century-old confession. She would orchestrate a reckoning. The fear for Leo was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now fuel. She would protect him by ending this, not by running from it. She picked up her phone, her fingers scrolling through her contacts until she found the name of a local journalist, a woman who had written a series of hard-hitting articles on corporate corruption and historical injustices. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot she had. She took a deep breath and made the call. She was no longer just the inheritor of a factory. She was the custodian of its ghosts, and she was about to give them a voice. Anika met the journalist, a woman named Sarah Jenkins, in a quiet, out-of-the-way diner. Sarah was in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and a weary skepticism that Anika found reassuring. She listened intently as Anika, her voice low and steady, laid out the entire story, from the inheritance letter to the threats from Julian Thorne. She presented the journal, the blueprint, and the brass key, placing them on the table between them like exhibits in a trial. Sarah picked up the journal, her reverence for the object obvious. She handled it with care, her expression shifting from skepticism to fascination, and then to shock as she read key passages Anika pointed out. This is incredible, Sarah breathed, looking up at Anika, her professional guard momentarily down. The sterling matchworks, the local legends are all true. They're not legends, Anika said quietly. They're memories, and I have the proof. She didn't tell Sarah about the specific nature of the treasure. She only described it as Silas's true legacy, a fortune significant enough to motivate a century-long search and modern-day corporate intimidation. She needed to hold that card close, to use it as her final undeniable piece of leverage. Sarah's journalistic instincts took over. Thorne's company, you're sure they're connected to Silas's original partners? His words, his threats, it all points to it, Anika said. He called it a legitimate historical claim. He knows something is there. He just doesn't know that I've already found it. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes bright with a fierce intensity. This is more than a story about a lost fortune. This is about corporate accountability, historical crime, and the generational impact of greed. If we can prove that Thorne's company is knowingly trying to recover the proceeds of a criminal enterprise, especially one founded on murder and exploitation, the fallout would be catastrophic for them. A plan began to take shape between them, a careful strategy to bring the story to light in a way that would protect Anika and Leo while exposing Thorne. They needed more than just the journal. They needed corroboration. They needed to build an ironclad case before they went public. The first step was to discreetly authenticate the journal and the blueprint. Sarah had a contact, a forensic document expert at the local university. The second step was to research Thorne's corporation, a massive labyrinthine entity called OmniCorp Development. Sarah would dig into their corporate history, looking for any link, however tenuous, to Silas Sterling's era. The third and most crucial step was to secure the diamonds and the journal in a safe place, away from Anika's apartment. They couldn't risk Thorne making a move to steal them. Sarah suggested a secure bank vault, rented under a pseudonym. As she worked with Sarah, Anika felt a profound shift in her own identity. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was an active agent of justice. The purpose that had been flickering within her now burned with a steady flame. She was not just doing this for herself or for the dead. She was doing it for her son. She looked at Leo playing with his toy cars on the worn carpet of their living room and saw the future. She wanted him to inherit not a fortune, but a legacy of courage and integrity. She wanted him to know that his mother had been faced with a choice between easy wealth and doing the right thing. And she had chosen the right thing, no matter the guados. This realization clarified her ultimate goal for the fortune. It could not belong to her. It could not be her escape. Silas's final wish was for it to heal the wounds. Anika knew exactly what that meant. The wealth had to be given back. She envisioned a foundation, the Sterling Memorial Fund. Its mission would be twofold. First, to find and compensate the descendants of the original Sterling Matchworks employees, the families of people like Alara and Marcus, whose lives had been broken by the factory. Second, to fund the environmental cleanup of the Sterling site and other similar post-industrial brownfields, transforming these toxic scars into parks or community centers. The money would be used to reverse the damage Silas had done to turn his poison into medicine. It was an act of restorative justice on a grand scale. The idea was so powerful, so right, that it eclipsed any lingering temptation to keep the money for herself. This was a better future, not just for her and Leo, but for the entire community. It was a legacy of healing, not of hoarding. The path ahead was still fraught with danger. Thorne and OmniCorp would not give up easily. But Anika was no longer alone. She had an ally in Sarah, and she had a cause that was undeniably just. She had a plan. She would use Silas's confession and his cursed treasure to dismantle the very system of corporate greed and impunity that he had embodied. She would turn his monument to avarice into a symbol of redemption. The final act was about to begin. She was ready. The days that followed were a blur of clandestine activity, a high-stakes game of chess played in the shadows. Anika, with Sarah's guidance, moved the lid-lined boxes from the factory vault to a secure, anonymous safe deposit box at a downtown bank. The physical act of transporting the immense wealth was terrifying. Every car that passed them on the road seemed like a threat. Every person on the street a potential observer. They moved at night using Anika's rattling sedan, a humble chariot for a king's ransom. With the diamonds in the journal secured, a palpable layer of tension was removed, but the danger remained. Sarah's research into OmniCorp development began to yield results. The corporation was a modern behemoth, but its roots ran deep. Through a series of mergers and acquisitions over the decades, She traced its lineage back to a powerful Gilded Age investment firm. And on that firm's list of original partners from the 1880s were two names that also appeared in Silas Sterling's private ledgers as his primary investors. The connection was undeniable. Omnicorp was the direct corporate descendant of the men Silas had feared, the vultures he had hidden his fortune from. Thorne's historical claim was real. They had been searching for this for generations. Meanwhile, the forensic expert confirmed that the journal, ink, and paper were all authentic to the late 19th century. The blueprint was drawn by the same hand. They now had a verified confession, a map, and a clear link to a modern, powerful adversary. The pieces were all in place. All that was left was the final confrontation. Thorne, sensing he was losing control, made his move. He didn't call this time. He appeared. Anika was walking Leo home from school when a sleek black town car pulled up beside them. The back window glided down, revealing Julian Thorne, his face a mask of cold, predatory civility. "Ms. Washington," he said, his eyes flicking to Leo before settling back on her. "A moment of your time." Anika's heart hammered against her ribs. She instinctively pulled Leo closer, her body forming a shield. "We have nothing to talk about," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I think we do," Thorne said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "You've been a busy woman, visiting banks, meeting with reporters. You seem to be under the impression that you've found something that belongs to you." "I found the truth," Anika shot back, "and it belongs to everyone." Thorne's smile tightened. "Let me be perfectly clear. My associates and I are prepared to offer you $1 million. A wire transfer, clean, untraceable. You sign a non-disclosure agreement. You turn over everything you found, the journal, the key, and whatever else, and you disappear. You and your son can have a very comfortable life anywhere you want." It was the ultimate temptation. 25,000 had been life-changing. $1 million was generational wealth. It was the easy path, the safe path. But Anika looked down at her son, whose small hand was gripping hers tightly, and she saw the faces of Alara, Marcus, and Daniel. She saw the price that had been paid for that money. "It's not for sale," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity and strength she didn't know she possessed. Thorne's facade finally cracked. The civility vanished, replaced by a raw, undisguised fury. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he hissed. "That property, and everything in it, is the rightful asset of my corporation. We will not be denied by a broke, sentimental fool. We will crush you. We will take the factory. We will take whatever is inside it, and we will bury you in legal fees and lawsuits until you have nothing left. I will see to it personally." The car sped away, leaving Anika and Leo standing on the sidewalk in a cloud of exhaust fumes. The threat was no longer veiled. It was a declaration of war. That night, Anika couldn't sleep. The confrontation had shaken her to her core. Thorne was right. She was outmatched. She was a single person against a corporate giant with limitless resources. But she had the truth, she had the evidence, and she had a plan. The next morning, she and Sarah executed it. Sarah published her explosive story online, a meticulously researched piece complete with authenticated excerpts from the journal, the blueprint, and the documented link between Omnicorp and Silas Sterling. The headline was stark. "The Sterling Curse: How a Modern Development Giant is Trying to Claim a 100-Year-Old Fortune Built on Murder, and Exploitation." Simultaneously, Anika, accompanied by a lawyer Sarah had arranged, walked into the office of the state's attorney general. She handed over a copy of the journal and a sworn affidavit detailing everything, including Thorne's threats against her and her son, and she made her proposal. She would turn over the entire fortune, every last gemstone, on one condition: that it be used to create the Sterling Memorial Fund, exactly as she had envisioned, to be administered by a state-appointed trust. She was giving it all away. The reckoning had begun. The story exploded. It was picked up by national news outlets. A modern-day David and Goliath story with a Gilded Age mystery at its core. Omnicorp's stock plummeted. Thorne and the board were hit with a firestorm of public outrage and media scrutiny. The Attorney General launched a full-scale investigation into Omnicorp, not just for its harassment of Anika, but for its historical ties to the criminal enterprise. Thorne was exposed, his threats against Anika and Leo making him the villain of a story that had captured the nation's imagination. He had tried to crush her, but in doing so, he had only made her more powerful. In the end, the confrontation was not one of violence, but of wills. And Anika, armed with the truth and a moral clarity that Thorne could not comprehend, had won. Omnicorp, facing legal and financial ruin, had no choice but to publicly renounce any claim to the Sterling property and its contents. Thorne was fired. Anika stood in the Attorney General's office, watching as the lead line boxes were opened, the diamonds spilling onto a velvet cloth under the bright official lights, their fire seeming less sinister now, more hopeful. She had done it. She had fulfilled Silas's final wish. She had performed the act of immense sacrifice. In giving away the fortune, she had redeemed it. And in the process, she had redeemed herself, transforming from a woman struggling to survive into a figure of profound moral strength. She had claimed her true inheritance.